From nude swimming, to wrestling beatdowns, to vomiting on foreign leaders. This is every US president's weirdest fact. And some of them are so bizarre, you'll be wondering how these guys even got elected in the first place. Like George Washington, a man whose dental problems were so horrific, he only had one real tooth left by the time he became president. And no, despite the myth, his dentures weren't wooden. They were so much worse. They were a Frankenstein mix of human teeth, cow and horse teeth, hippopotamus ivory, and metal springs to keep it all together. And this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was borderline torture. His dentures creaked, shifted, and made his jaw bulge so noticeably that he rarely smiled in portraits. But if you think that's scary, just wait till you meet John Adams' dog, Satan. 'Cause Adams had two dogs at the White House, Juno, aw, and Satan, ugh. And to this day, no one knows why he gave one of them the most diabolical name imaginable. But historians theorize it's because Adams had a famously dry sense of humor. So Satan was likely a chaotic little menace around the house. Imagine showing up to talk politics and getting barked at by Satan. But even that's not as disturbing as Thomas Jefferson, who had a decades-long relationship with one of his slaves. 'Cause Jefferson fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings and never publicly acknowledged the relationship. However, thanks to modern DNA testing, we can now say with full Maury Povich confidence, you are the father. But it gets even more twisted. Sally Hemings was actually his wife's half-sister, and Jefferson kept her and their kids enslaved after being born. That's absolutely insane, especially coming from the guy who wrote All Men Are Created Equal. But while Jefferson was tangled in contradictions, his political protege was sharp, serious, and pretty dang small. 'Cause James Madison stood at just 5 foot 4 inches and barely cracked 100 pounds, the smallest president in US history. They called him Little Jimmy, but this little man was the chief architect of the Constitution, helped draft the Bill of Rights, and co-founded the Democratic-Republican Party. So while he may have been a short king, James Madison left a massive legacy. But speaking of legacies, we can't forget James Monroe, the only US president with a foreign capital named after him, Monrovia, Liberia. Yeah, all the way in Africa. Monroe supported resettling freed African Americans in West Africa rather than integrating them back into American society. In 1822, they named the capital Monrovia in his honor. But while some presidents enjoyed their own capital, other presidents enjoyed skinny dipping. 'Cause every morning, John Quincy Adams would strip down and take a nude swim in the Potomac River. And in 1825, reporter Anne Royale sat on his clothes while he was in the river and refused to move until he agreed to an interview, making John Quincy Adams the only president in history to be interviewed butt naked. Talk about a transparent administration. You're welcome. But if Adams was the kind of guy who skinny dipped at sunrise, Andrew Jackson was the kind of dude who'd shoot you before breakfast. 'Cause Jackson was involved in over 100 duels. And in 1806, when lawyer Charles Dickinson insulted his wife, Jackson challenged him to a duel. But Dickinson fired first and struck Jackson in the chest. While still standing and bleeding out, Jackson calmly returned fire, killing Dickinson with a single shot. But after the chaos of Jackson, Martin Van Buren stepped in with polished boots, perfect hair, and a slogan that accidentally gave the world its favorite word, okay. His nickname, Old Kinderhook, became the rallying cry, vote for okay. At the same time, Americans were spelling all correct like this. Put it all together, and boom, we got the word okay. But I wish someone asked this next president if he was okay. 'Cause William Henry Harrison had the shortest presidency, dying just 31 days into office from contaminated White House drinking water. And during his brief stay, Harrison had an exotic pet goat that roamed the grounds and once headbutted a cabinet member. Ouch! Between the goat attacks and toxic water, William Henry Harrison's presidency was a short-term circus. Unlike this next guy, who kicked off the longest-running presidential bloodline in American history. Because John Tyler had 15 children, the most of any president. But here's the crazy part. Tyler was born in 1790, yet his grandchildren lived well into the 2010s. One passed away in 2020. How's that even possible? Well, Tyler fathered his last child at 70, creating a direct family line from George Washington's era to the iPhone era. That's not a family tree, that's a friggin' time machine. Get in, Doc, we're going back to 1845. Because James K. Polk was out here grinding like there's no tomorrow. After campaigning on being a one-term president, Polk kept his promise and powered through with strong coffee and 12 to 16-hour days. But sadly, 103 days after leaving office, Polk died from illness and exhaustion, giving him the shortest retirement of any U.S. president. We didn't even get to play golf. But after Polk came war hero Zachary Taylor, who moved into the White House and brought his beloved warhorse, Old Whitey, who turned into a fan favorite because visitors would pluck hairs from his tail as souvenirs to the point where it eventually went bald. So White House staff had to step in to protect the horse until Zachary Taylor suddenly died from eating raw cherries and Old Whitey reappeared, proudly marching in his funeral with his tail fully regrown. But after Taylor went out on some stomach trouble, Millard Fillmore stepped in and had plumbing on the brain. Because for years, people claimed he installed the first bathtub in the White House. But turns out, that's an urban myth. In reality, Fillmore had a love for libraries. Because when a massive fire broke out in the Library of Congress in 1851, he personally helped form a bucket brigade to save books from burning. What a good Samaritan. Unlike Franklin Pierce, who was the only sitting president ever arrested. Well, allegedly. Cause in 1853, Pierce accidentally ran over an elderly woman with his carriage and was arrested for reckless driving. Reckless carriaging? Horsing? I don't know. But here's the twist. There's no arrest record, no news coverage, and no mention in his personal letters. So, historians think the whole thing is a myth. But if you ask me, maybe the government swept it under the rug to protect Pierce's image. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a bald eagle with top secret security clearance. Speaking of presidential mysteries, James Buchanan's love life was quite the head-scratcher. Cuz Buchanan was the only unmarried president. And his unusually close relationship with Senator William King really got people talking. Like Andrew Jackson, who called him Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Were the two an item? No one really knows. But in private letters, Buchanan did refer to King as his better half and my wife. But one thing that's not up for debate is Abe Lincoln's freakish athleticism. At 6 foot 4 inches, Lincoln was a wrestling champion who won 299 out of 300 matches. In 1831, 22-year-old Lincoln faced off against Jack Armstrong, leader of a local gang. And after a gritty back and forth, Lincoln slammed Armstrong to the ground, earning the gang's respect. And over a century later, Lincoln's legendary status was made official when he was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1992. Meanwhile, Andrew Johnson had fashion on the mind. Because before politics, Johnson worked as a tailor, and even after making it to the White House, cut and sewed one of his own inaugural suits by hand. But that's nothing compared to Ulysses S. Grant, who got pulled over for speeding 3 times during his presidency. Because Grant had a serious need for speed and loved racing down D.C. streets. In 1872, a police officer stopped him, not realizing he'd flagged down the president. But even after figuring it out, the officer still handed him a ticket, which makes Grant the first and only U.S. president with a moving violation. But after Grant galloped through D.C., Rutherford B. Hayes became the first U.S. president to pick up a telephone because Alexander Graham Bell assigned Hayes' phone number, 1. Imagine telling people your phone number is literally 1. But Hayes found the phone confusing and barely used it. When Bell called him up, Hayes said, "Great invention, but who would ever use one?" I think the answer turned out to be everyone. But unlike Hayes, James Garfield had a bit more brain power and might have been the smartest man to ever sit in the Oval Office. Because Garfield was an ambidextrous genius who could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time. He's also the only president to publish an original mathematical proof of the Pythagorean theorem. What can't this guy do? But it's hilarious that our most brilliant president was followed up by a guy who loved pants? Because Chester Arthur owned over 80 pairs of pants and changed outfits multiple times a day. He took late-night strolls to window shop luxury clothes, and one reporter joked Arthur would rather lose a vote than a good tailor. But while Arthur was shopping for silk ties, Grover Cleveland was executing people. Before his presidency, Cleveland served as sheriff and twice acted as official hangman, personally pulling the lever on convicted murderers. And when others offered to handle the grim duty, Cleveland refused, wanting to spare them the guilt. That's kinda wholesome, I think. But this also became campaign ammo for his opponents, who later mocked that he appeared mighty comfortable around a gallows. So instead of handling executions, our next president was handling dinner plates. Because Benjamin Harrison was William Henry Harrison's grandson, the only grandfather-grandson presidential duo. And when Benjamin took office, he used the same White House china his grandfather had purchased 48 years earlier. However, Harrison joked that the only advantage of being related to a president was some old dinner plates. But for William McKinley, his good luck charm wasn't inherited. It was the red carnation he always wore in his lapel, which he believed brought him good fortune. Until he took it off at an event, handed it to a little girl, and minutes later, bang! And the red carnation became Ohio State flower in his memory. But speaking of flying bullets, did you know Teddy Roosevelt gave an 84-minute speech with a bullet lodged in his chest? While on the campaign trail, Teddy was shot at point-blank range. The bullet tore through his coat, eyeglass case, and a 50-page folded speech, which slowed the bullet just enough to spare his life. And with a bullet lodged near his rib, Roosevelt stood up and delivered an 84-minute speech before going to the hospital. What a legend! But speaking of old legends, most people think William Howard Taft was so big he got stuck in a bathtub. Turns out that story's a total myth. Taft did, however, install an extra-large custom bathtub big enough to fit 4 grown men. 'Cause at 340 pounds, the man needed a little room. But if you think that's wild, wait till you hear about the First Lady who quietly took over the country. Because in 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed. And for 17 months, his wife Edith Wilson stepped in behind the scenes, screening visitors, controlling paperwork, and effectively running the executive branch. All while the public had no idea. But at least that's not as reckless as Warren G. Harding, who gambled away a priceless set of White House china in a hand of poker. 'Cause in a raucous poker night at the White House, Harding wagered china dating back to James Madison. And he lost. His advisors were horrified. But Harding? He just laughed it off. Considering his presidency was rife with corruption, that china was probably the least valuable thing he lost. But one thing this next president wasn't going to lose was his pet raccoon. 'Cause in 1926, Calvin Coolidge was sent a live raccoon for Thanksgiving dinner. And instead of eating it, he pardoned the raccoon, named her Rebecca, and made her a White House pet. The First Lady even walked her on a leash around the grounds. Too bad the turkey didn't get that kind of treatment. But believe it or not, the Coolidges weren't as peculiar as the Hoovers, who were intensely private people and spoke Mandarin to each other to confuse eavesdroppers. But it went even further. Herbert Hoover hated encountering servants in the hallways, so an elaborate system of bells and signals was installed to warn when the president was approaching. The staff were told to flatten themselves against walls or dive into rooms when he walked by. But while Hoover's staff feared seeing the president, FDR feared seeing something else entirely. The number 13. 'Cause Franklin Roosevelt suffered from triskaidekaphobia, intense fear of the number 13. He refused to travel on the 13th, sit at a table with 13 guests, or launch initiatives on Friday the 13th. This is the same guy who took on Hitler in the Great Depression. But a prime number is where he drew the line. You know what else has got me shaking my beak? Harry Truman's middle name. 'Cause the S in Harry S. Truman doesn't actually stand for anything. Yeah, it's literally just the letter S, a compromise to honor both grandfathers. And even though you'll often see a period next to it, just remember it's nothing more than one letter. Kinda weird. Just like the bizarre irony of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who grew up in a deeply religious pacifist household that opposed violence. Yet Ike went on to become one of the most celebrated World War II generals, leading the Allied invasion of Normandy and defeating Nazi Germany. From pacifist roots to defeating Hitler. Talk about a plot twist. But speaking of twists and turns, let's talk about John F. Kennedy's love life. Because this president wasn't just a leader, he was a full-on womanizer. He had affairs with celebrities, interns, and even spies, like Ellen Romesh, a stunning socialite who had ties to East German intelligence. Or Marilyn Monroe, who delivered a sultry Happy Birthday Mr. President performance at Madison Square Garden. Or even a 19-year-old White House intern who JFK seduced in her first week. This man was an animal. Poor Jackie. But you know who else deserves sympathy? Lyndon B. Johnson's staff. 'Cause LBJ had no concept of personal boundaries. He held meetings while sitting on the toilet, door wide open. And he would even relieve himself outdoors in front of staff, reporters, and Secret Service. Sir, can you put that away, please? Gross. At least Richard Nixon added something cool to the White House. 'Cause in 1969, Nixon had a private one-lane bowling alley installed underneath the building. He'd sneak down late at night in his suit to bowl and clear his head. And his high score? Over 200. But after Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford was sworn into office, making him the only person to serve as both vice president and president without ever being elected. 'Cause Nixon appointed Ford as VP when Spiro Agnew resigned. And when Watergate took down Nixon, Ford moved up again. Unelected, but fully constitutional. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. But speaking of presidential anomalies, did you know that Jimmy Carter saw a UFO? 'Cause in 1969, Carter witnessed a strange green light and filed an official report. During his 1976 campaign, he promised to declassify government UFO files, but Cold War pressures changed his mind. Carter remains the only US president to formally report a UFO sighting. But while Carter was searching for UFOs, Ronald Reagan was making movies. 'Cause before politics, Reagan appeared in over 50 films. But one of his most heroic roles came before the cameras, when he was a young lifeguard and saved 77 people from drowning over 7 summers. After each rescue, he carved a notch into a wooden log, which he proudly brought into the Oval Office when he became president. But Reagan wasn't the only adventurous president, because George H.W. Bush took birthday parties to new heights. When celebrating his 75th, 80th, 85th, and 90th birthdays, Bush jumped out of airplanes over his house in Maine, saying, just because you're an old guy, you don't have to sit around drooling in the corner. Which is great, because sitting is exactly what got him into trouble overseas. In 1992, Bush vomited on the Japanese Prime Minister during a state dinner, inspiring the Japanese slang Bushusuru to do the Bush thing. So while skydiving might be risky, at least it's safer than sushi with diplomats. And speaking of high-risk presidents, we can't forget about Bill Clinton, who had a 2-year affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, famously denying it. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Well, he did. Can you be a little less creepy, Bill? Like George W. Bush, who managed to avoid affairs, scandals, and even flying shoes. 'Cause in 2008, an Iraqi journalist hurled both shoes at Bush during a Baghdad press conference. Bush dodged him like a pro and cracked, "All I can report is that it was a size 10. Nice reflexes for a commander-in-chief. But like Bush's reaction time, Obama had some athleticism of his own. 'Cause he converted the White House tennis court into a basketball court and hosted pickup games against NBA stars like LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. Obama was famously competitive with his smooth left-handed jump shot. Even his staffers were trying not to get dunked on by the POTUS. But the athletic streak doesn't stop with Obama, because Donald Trump is the only president enshrined in the WWE Hall of Fame. As a longtime wrestling fan, Trump hosted WrestleMania events at his Atlantic City casino. And at WrestleMania 23, he stepped into the ring, tackled Vince McMahon, and shaved his head clean in front of a roaring crowd. And finally, we got Joe Biden, whose political career spans over 50 years. Sadly, it started under tragic circumstances. After winning his first Senate race, Biden's wife and daughter were killed in a car accident, and his 2 young sons were critically injured. Biden became one of the only senators to be sworn in from a hospital room. And decades later, he became president. The ultimate comeback arc. And there you have it. Every US president's most bizarre fact. And if you thought that was disturbing, wait till you see which presidents secretly hated each other. From name-calling, to backstabbing, to full-blown political sabotage. These are US presidents who had some serious beef.